Hi, my name is Luzzei and I'll be presenting on trauma-informed care in the school system.
So, why trauma informed practices in schools?
As an informed educator, you are at the front lines of helping students achieve their best. Students show up to school every day with life experiences that are communicated in the form of behaviors. Educators can be a powerful force in understanding student functioning, which can create a change in the school climate and help students feel connected and safe in their classrooms. Meaning teachers are the solution. In this training, we will discuss trauma's connection to students' behaviors and ability to learn. We will also be discussing the legislative attention trauma-informed care has been receiving. We will also be discussing our school district's needs. And lastly, we will be learning about different strategies that we can employ in the classroom that are trauma-informed and lead to positive student outcomes.
So, what is trauma informed care?
I wanted to interject that the content in this presentation may be triggering for some, so if you need to take care of yourselves, that is completely fine. Trauma is an experience that is overwhelming, threatens one's mental and physical safety, and impacts one's relationships, value systems, and worldview. In a 2018 screening of 517 LAUSD students, 88% report experiencing 3 or more traumatic events in their lives. This shows the degree of how trauma is a silent epidemic that's afflicting so many of LAUSD students. In another study and screening, what was shown is that 98% of LAUSD students have experienced at least one trauma. While not all students have a therapist, every student has a teacher. So it's really important that teachers have a core understanding of how trauma can show up and affect students. Trauma symptoms often mirror other behaviors. For example, with the child with emotion regulation difficulties, they may appear explosive, impulsive, but one of the distinct features of trauma is that it activates the fight, flight, and freeze response. And often that can look like the child is disobeying or obstinate. So it's important to keep that in mind. Another feature is that is often misunderstood is when a child has difficulties forming close relationships with others. Often the child will look bossy or very shy and withdrawn. That is another distinct feature of trauma. And lastly, a child will often resort to reenactment in their relationship with other adult figures like their teachers. And usually, what's going on is that they are recreating a childhood dynamic they had with an adult caregiver or at home. So it's important to understand that a lot of times when children are engaging in these power struggles, it's to gain mastery over a power imbalance they experience at home. I like to include this drawing because I think it accurately depicts a lot of the beliefs that our students are carrying with them every single day. And it is important to be aware of these beliefs because children may misperceive our actions because they have these existing beliefs inside of them already. So even if our actions are innocuous, children are going to have an extreme reaction to them. So being mindful of this could help us support our most vulnerable students. One of the most important aspects of being trauma informed is adjusting our lenses. It means reforming our mentality of what is wrong with you to what happened to you. Because a lot of our students are not the way they are because there's something inherently bad about them, but instead it's because they were trying to survive against a really tragic or unfortunate circumstance. And they believe everyone is out to get them and that their world is unsafe. What's very important in supporting students who have experienced trauma is to give what you'd like to receive, which is an empathetic and listening ear. Doing this will promote a culture of understanding and mutual respect in your classroom. It will model appropriate ways to show that you care about others and your students are more likely to follow. Also, a huge aspect is to give students who have experienced trauma a lot of choices because a student's safety is their control. So taking that away from them can feel unsafe to them and trigger them heavily. Also, it's important to maintain routines and rituals because a huge component of trauma is that it just happened out of the blue and it was unpredictable. So creating a sense of predictability can create a safe space. And while we're on the topic of safe space, it's important to have cool down spots, ways to promote regulation in your classroom so that there's effective management of very difficult feelings that could arise due to trauma triggers. As discussed previously, students who have experienced adverse childhood experiences will often resort to being disruptive because they have this conception that they don't believe others are trustworthy. The world is not safe. And for that reason, they may engage in disruptive behaviors, they may explode. And for that reason, it's so important to attune to that child and in your supportive role. And doing so will help the child understand that it's not their fault. It's not your fault as an educator. It is trauma's fault. And just providing that understanding gives the students so much insight as to what's going on and help them identify that what is causing these intense emotional explosions. And the reality of the matter is that sometimes it will be hard to see if this is really what trauma seeping in or something else. And what is really beneficial in those cases is to communicate with the child and hold off from any assumptions. Having a curious mindset and exploring what could be going on is always the better route than assuming that a child is just trying to be disruptive because they don't want to follow the rules. So I always encourage active communication to model to the child that it's important to talk to someone and figure out what's going on. There was a concerted effort to integrate trauma-informed care into public policy. 2 trauma-informed bills were enacted and 28 were introduced to Congress in 2015. The first bill, the Justice for Victims of Human Trafficking Act, provided funding for trauma-informed care to victims of child human trafficking. The Every Student Succeeds Act, which passed in 2015, ensured that there was funds for training staff and administration in trauma-informed care and that trauma-informed care strategies were utilized in the classroom. It also funded school-based mental health services. Trauma-informed care has been gaining more legislative relevancy. From 2010 to 2015, 0 bills were trauma-informed or contain any trauma-informed sections. In 2015, 28 bills contained trauma-informed sections. A huge part of trauma-informed care is that we're mindful of how trauma impacts the survivor, and also we redesign the system so that it meets the needs of the survivors. And redesigning the system can look like being mindful of triggers, making sure that classroom curriculum is designed so that it can meet the needs of a variety of students, not just one type of student. And if we apply these principles to designing the system, then students can thrive and succeed, and there is equal access to education. Now we will discuss behavioral strategies for trauma-impacted youth. And I also wanted to say that these strategies are effective for students who haven't experienced trauma as well. The first strategy is emphasizing positive incentives over consequences. Due to the fact that many traumatized students have seen consequences as triggers because they've experienced abusive situations through the form of consequences, it is important to be mindful of this and to shift our accountability systems to be more rewards based. Having a more rewards based system does not diffuse responsibility from the student, but instead allows the student to want to work towards a given reward, and it really impacts their internal locus of control and motivation. A second strategy is collaborative problem solving, and that involves letting the student generate the solutions. This basically helps the student feel empowered and competent, and balances power in your relationship with your student. And they learn very important skills. Another strategy is to constantly emphasize what students are doing well versus focusing on their problematic behaviors. So I like to suggest a 10-to-1 ratio. 10 compliments for every constructive criticism. And the reason for this is so that because students tend to recreate what they're good at. So if they feel that they're good at attention seeking or disrupting class, they will aim to do that every day, versus if they feel like they're good at being connected to the material and also behaving, then they'll strive for that. Also, what is highly advisable is to have a calm down spot in your classroom. A lot of these students experience toxic stress in their homes and don't really have time for peace and quiet. Maybe they have really late bedtimes as well. So providing a calm down spot in your classroom allows peace and quiet and allows them to learn how to calm themselves and regulation skills so that they can be prepared to learn. Now we're going to discuss trauma-informed care discipline strategies. I wanted to emphasize that these strategies are not only effective with students who have experienced trauma, but all students can benefit from these strategies. So the first is a very helpful strategy since it basically does not trigger the child, which is restorative circles. Because a huge trigger for children who have experienced trauma is isolation. So this is community based and allows the students to form meaningful connections with others and allows them to take accountability. A huge component of trauma-informed care is responsibility and accountability. And through this method, students can gather in circles and basically learn from one another in the sense that they learn how their actions may have impacted another student and hear the thoughts and feelings that other student may have had because of this. This develops perspective taking skills and basically a mutual transaction that is based on respect and collaboration. This integrates social constructivist theory because
the learning is happening intrinsically and extrinsically. And rewards are provided by the knowledge community. It is collaborative and it is constructed within social contexts. So it is a very helpful method. Now, if the student wants a space to calm the fight, flight, freeze response and wants to be alone from peers in order to do that, it is really helpful if there is a designated space so the student can de escalate and return to baseline and also reflect on solutions that could have been reached and could be applied in a future situation. Allowing that type of way for the child to achieve calmness and de escalate can help the process of being able to reflect, because when a child is triggered, a child is not able to engage in that type of reflection because they are trying to survive and no rational thought is possible at that point. So, allowing that ability to decompress can really help this child engage in those skills you want them to engage in. Here are some wonderful resources to integrate trauma-informed care into your classroom. The first is fueledsschools.org, and I love this website because it has a lot of positive psychology strategies you can use and classroom management strategies. Also, there's a cool tool where you can gain insight as to how you were raised impacts your teaching style, and that's also very valuable to understand when you're working with your students. Another is Sound Discipline, and that one is a good resource to also get additional classroom management strategies that are trauma informed. Me Moves is a great resource because it has a lot of fun movement activities and self regulation activities so that students can use in the classroom to, if you need them to down regulate or up regulate. I included some book recommendations because I love books. Lost at School is a book written by Ross Greene, and he's a Harvard educated psychologist that specializes and created collaborative problem solving, which we discussed earlier in our presentation. Help for Billy is a great resource because it talks about how to use positive incentives instead of consequences. So I highly recommend checking out all these resources because they can definitely provide you a thorough, comprehensive review of trauma-informed care. And thank you for listening to my presentation.